We're going to do something a little different this morning in this lesson. We're going to primarily stay in Colossians chapter 3 as we study through this lesson. But want to notice some things here this morning that hopefully will help you and help us all as we strive to live godly in an ungodly world. The world today is a wreck, as we all know. It's a mess. And for the most part, we, of course, have to live in that. We as Christians have to live among that and try our best to live a godly life in this mess that we have as a world today. So we're going to notice some things here this morning and just want to talk about a couple things here as we go this morning. Some things that we should know about our world. And it's an interesting thought here as we consider some of these things. As you know, I'm kind of a numbers guy and I like statistics, and we'll look at some of those things here. So I did some research this week as I prepared for this lesson. And some of these numbers might shock you. Some of these numbers might not shock you. But we'll look at just a couple of things here this morning in regards to this. And a survey I noticed that said 9% of kids as young as 12 years old have admitted, that's the key word, admitted, trying to use drugs at least one time. 12 years old. Now think about that. How old is that? What is that? About third grade? Fourth? Let's see. Sixth grade. Sixth grade. Sixth grade. Think about that. 9% of kids in the sixth grade have used or at least tried drugs at some point. Staggering. Children as young as 5 years old have been known to be involved in pornography. Now think about that. 5! Now that's kindergarten. That's kindergarten or first grade. What an unreal, amazing statistic that we are looking at here. 5 years old. Well, you know, we all carry these crazy little cell phones around, and that the age of technology has gotten more and more popular. And as that grows, so do these numbers. And it's staggering, and it should scare us. It should alarm us, and it should wake us up to the ungodliness in this world today. 5 years old. In 2007, the survey says that 71% of Americans said that they believed in God. 71%. And as 7 years later, in 2014, that number had dropped to 63% of Americans believe that there is a God. 63%, that's almost half, just a little over half. Of course, we're 4 years past that survey, and so it might be down even lower than that. Staggering to think. In 1960, the survey was studied that 63% of Americans said that they attended church on a regular basis. In 2014, that number is at 37%. That's 1 in 3 Americans actually go to church. What in the world's going on? 1960, some of us are here today, were members of the church in 1960, right? Darwin probably was, Don was, I know Don Smith was. Was the church different at that time? In some ways, there are a lot of similarities. We still do preach the same gospel, of course. But the church had a different feel at that time. I've talked to those that were around in the 60s. The church had a different feel, didn't it? It had a feel of community. And if you didn't go to church, it was unusual for you not to go to church in the 60s. Now, 2014, 2018 coming up, it's unusual if you do go to church. If you attend church today, you're somewhat of an oddball. You're 1 in 3, 37% of Americans, at least according to this survey. I think it's probably pretty accurate too. When you consider the landscape of our world today and how God is just being, and the idea of religion is just abused today in our culture. Well, sadly, the church, we've lost a couple generations of people. And really, we're working on a third. Generation, they say, is about 15 years or so, 15 to 20 years, something like that. So if I'm 50, the generation after me, those that are 30, 35, where are they at today? Look around. Our church is a little unique where we have a good mixture of young and old and whatever. But that generation in its 30s and then the next generation in its 20s, where are they? They have gone. They have left the church. The church has lost them. We have lost a lot of the folks. And it goes back to our culture in a lot of ways. The church as a whole in our world, our society as a whole, is just downgraded religion in many, many ways. Well, living godly, though, in that world is a job, isn't it? It's a chore. And we all understand that. So what can we do? What can we do to save this generation that we're in now? Matt and I and a couple others got together and we were talking about the future and some plans we have for the future here for the congregation. And it struck me one of the major things that I think even Matt was the one that said it. The thing that scares him to death, and it should us all, is where will my kids be in 10 years? Seth is 18, coming up soon. Where will he be when he's 28? Well, he's faithful now, and we're thankful for that. But will he be when he's 28? I hope so. But it scares me. It's a scary thought to think that our children might be leaving us. So what can we do? Well, first thing, we need to do a better job with teaching our children. We need to do a better job with instructing them on things like we're going to talk about this morning. Living godly in an ungodly world. How are we doing with that? Well, we teach them a lot of things. We talk about a lot of things. We talk about godly things. Well, that's one thing we can do. I can be a better example. That's one thing I can do. I can be better. You can be better, right? We all can be better at setting the standard and setting the example for our children so that this generation won't be lost to the world. We must start making God a major part of our lives and making God our number one priority. What has happened is our society is not. Our society has let that drift. Our society has let God slip through the cracks and put Him under the rug, behind the closed doors, and have downplayed it. We, the church, must step up and make God a part of our lives. You know, our children know us better than anybody. And they know when we're true and when we're not. They know when we're sincere and when we're not. They can see through us, can't they? I can see through my parents. And I know Seth can see through me. When I'm sincere and when I'm not. And when I'm really, truly putting God first in my life. Or am I just playing? Well, interesting things to think about. Titus chapter 2, the verse we talked about in our reading this morning. Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. That's all of us. Teaching us, and here's what it teaches us. That denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. That's one of the biggest things we can do to help this generation become more godly, is to live godly ourselves. To become godly people and putting God first in our lives. Our young folks are watching, and we don't want this generation to slip through our fingers like the previous one did, and the one before that, and probably the one before that. Living godly in an ungodly age. Well, what does God call us to do? God calls His people to do some things. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 20 and 21, now then, we are ambassadors for Christ. What's an ambassador? The United States has ambassadors to different countries, right? Well, they go to these countries and they represent the United States in whatever they're looking into. We are ambassadors. We represent the church and we represent Christ as through God were pleading through us. Isn't that interesting? God is pleading through us to the folks. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That's what he implores. God is calling us today to live godly, to be godly people. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 15 and 16, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in what? All your conduct. Because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. God is calling us to be holy folks. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 7. For God did not call us to uncleanness, but in holiness. God expects his people to be godly. God expects his people to be holy. God expects his people to listen to his call. Living godly in an ungodly age. It's not an easy problem. It's not an easy process. No one said it was going to be easy, but we have called to do that. Colossians chapter 3 reminds us of these things. It reminds us that we're to put to death a few things. And it's written in the first part of Colossians 3 in that it's a foregone conclusion. In other words, you're a Christian. Notice what he says here in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, and then verse 5 with me. If then you were raised with Christ. Who is that? Well, that's Christians. We've been raised from the dead in baptism, right? Remember? So, that's a foregone conclusion. We get that. If you then have been raised with Christ, what? Seek those things which are above. Christ is sitting on the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above and not on things of the earth. Part of why our culture is the way it is, because of verse 2. We haven't really set our minds on doing godly things. We've set our mind on doing earthly things. Oh, we're good at that. But setting our mind on godly things, we've kind of dropped the ball on. Verse 3, for you died, and your life is hidden in Christ, with Christ in God. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth. Fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desires, covetousness, which is idolatry. Get rid of, put to death, bury them, because you are Christians. Act like it, is what he's saying. You're a Christian. You've been raised from the dead. Start acting like it. That's basically what he's trying to say. So, for the time I have here, quickly as we go on here, living godly in an ungodly world, one of the things that he tells us to put to death is fornication. What is fornication? Having sex outside of marriage is what it means. Our world says, oh, that's okay. You see, that's nothing wrong with that. Just be safe when you're doing it. What does God say? Put it to death. Don't do it. Stop it. And yet, those of us that are Christians should have already put this stuff away, he said. Remember, we're part of those that had been risen with Christ. Fornication is one of those things that our world says is just fine and dandy. Just be careful. And yet God says, stop it. Don't do it unless you're married. See where our culture has gone? See where our world is? Our world is so far removed from what God said. And there's no wonder we're losing generations of folks to the world. Fornication is something we've got to stop if we're involved in that. Uncleanness, or this idea of moral impurity. If you'll remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where he spoke of those at Corinth were comparing themselves by themselves. Remember? 2 Corinthians chapter 10 speaks of that. What does that mean? Well, as long as I'm not as bad as that person, then it's okay. I'm doing good. And so I set my moral standards based on her and him. and us and our world. And so I'm not as bad as some folks, and so that makes me okay. No, it doesn't. That's comparing yourselves with yourselves. What are we supposed to compare ourselves with? Be godly as godly. Be holy as I am holy, 1 Peter. We just looked at. So our standards are wrong. We set the standards based on us and what we think is right and wrong, instead of what God says is right and wrong. See how we've got it all messed up? There's no wonder. There's no wonder we've lost the generations of the church that we have. It's a wonder we're doing as well as we are. Passions, or this idea of lust, totally out of control in our society, isn't it? You can't turn on the television without being bombarded with things that will drag your attention away from godly things. Evil desires, the idea of desiring things that we have no business desiring. Looking towards worldly things. God says, put these things away. Kill them. Put them to death. Put them off. Get them off. These things should already be dead in your life because you're a Christian. You've been raised with Christ in baptism. These things should be already gone. Yet sometimes we hang on to them, don't we? Covetousness, this idea of wanting what you have. And going to do whatever I can do to get what you got and hope you don't get more. You see what our world has done? We're supposed to live godly in this ungodly world. Well, what happens to us when we get involved in those things? Well, next verse here in Colossians chapter 3, verses 6 and 7 tells us, because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you once walked, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. See, past tense. That's supposed to be past tense. You once acted that way, but now you don't walk that way. Now you don't act like that. You don't involve yourself in fornication. You don't involve yourself in the things that we looked at here. These ideas of the earthly things. We don't involve ourselves with lust. We don't involve ourselves in covetousness and the such. You see? That's why he says. So what happens to us when we get involved in these things? The wrath of God is going to come upon you, is what he said. Well, that's not a popular subject either. And preachers aren't supposed to preach about that sort of stuff. Yeah, we are. So, the Bible, of course, in Colossians 3 tells us that we're to put off some things. Notice here, if you will, in Colossians chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. But now you yourselves are to put off these things: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Sound familiar? Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds. In other words, you're a Christian now. These things should be put away from you. And have put on the new man. How do we do that? Through baptism. Remember, we rise to walk in newness of life. And have put on the new man, who is renewed in how? Knowledge, according to the image of him who created him. You see, this is where we're at. And these are the things that now Colossians 3 reminds us, put away from us. Get them off of you. Get these things away from you. What were they again? Remember, I preached a sermon a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, I guess now, about the crucifixion and how sometimes we gloss over words and we don't really think about them. That's what this kind of verse is. Sometimes we do the same with this kind of a verse too. Put away, put off anger. Remember the time when before we were Christians, maybe we were hot-tempered. Now, as a Christian, these are some things we're supposed to get rid of. Having this idea of anger. Anger can become sin when we let it get out of control. How easily can that happen? Well, we all know how easily that can happen. And then, of course, he tells us to be careful with the wrath, which becomes the hot anger. We've all been there, right? We know what that means, and we become violent with it. Or you ever want to get so mad you want to strangle somebody? That's the kind of anger, and that's the kind of wrath he's talking about. We should put away. Get it away from you. Put it off. Malice, that's this idea of ill will. You see how it escalates? It goes from anger, being mad, to really wanting to strangle somebody, to now I don't even want anything good to happen to this person. Ill will. A desire to do evil. Sound familiar to our culture? Yet, the problem is we Christians live in this culture. We live in this environment, and yet we're to live godly in this environment. Blasphemy, that's speaking evil of God and or really of someone else. Put these things off, he says. Bad language or ideas, filthy jokes or bad words, things that we should use. Why does that matter? Why does it matter what I say? What you say does matter, doesn't it? It's an insight on really your spirituality. The kind of words we use, the kind of things we do, the kind of things we say, the kind of jokes we talk about. It's an insight really of your spirituality, of what kind of person you really are. That's exactly why we should be careful and put these kind of things off from us. Of course, lying, this idea of misleading somebody. Why would he even have to tell Christians this? Why would he have to even explain this again to Christians? Because sometimes we don't put them off. Because sometimes we hang on to some of these things and we still make them a part of our life even though we're trying to live godly, don't we? He says, get rid of them. Put them off. Get it away from you as a Christian. Living godly in an ungodly world. Well, some things now as we conclude this lesson. Some things that we are to put on as Christians. And he talks about that here as we go on in Colossians chapter 3. If you've noticed with me, verse 12 through 16. Therefore, as the elect of God, who is that? Christians, you and I, those of us that are Christians, holy and beloved. See, we're past all those things before. We're past all those things that we have those things been before. We put those things away that we just talked about. We're living godly. We're trying to live godly. So he says, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on some things. Adopt these things into your life. Put them on. Tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering. You see a huge contrast from the things he told you to put off to what he tells you to put on? It's the exact total opposite, isn't it? Put on these things. Bearing with one another. Forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you must do also. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts. Our society tells you to let your temper rule you. Let your conscience be your guide. And morals are based upon whatever you want morals to be. Isn't that what? That's what it says. This tells us, Colossians 3:15 says, let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which you also were called in one body, that's the church, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you. Does the word of Christ dwell in you today? Well, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Right? If we put on these things, it will. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in songs, hymns, spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. It's hard to sing when you're mad, right? You ever thought about that? It's hard to be happy. It's hard to be praising God if I'm angry. Remember, those are the things I'm supposed to put off. Remember? Anger, wrath, this hot anger where I want to strangle somebody. It's hard to praise God, isn't it, when you're doing that? That's why he says to put those things off. Get them away from you and put these things on. So let's notice these things in conclusion this morning. Tender mercy, that's compassion. That's tender mercies. Or some versions said bowels of mercy. In other words, it's coming from your guts. This is the kind of compassion that's not fakey. It's compassion that's true. It's tender Tender mercies. Kindness. That's showing kindness towards others. See the contrast between what he told us to put off and what we're to put on? Complete, total, 100% opposites. Showing kindness towards others. Humility. Our world is not a humble. We don't have humbleness of mind or lowliness of mind, do we, in our world today? But yet God is calling us to do that. Live godly in this present world. To do that, I'm going to have a lowliness or humility in my mind. Not to be arrogant, not to be haughty. Meekness. We think sometimes meekness is wimpy. Oh, he's meek, and so he's going to hide and cower into the corner. It's not what meekness means. It's strength. You just got it under control. That's what it means. It's strength under control. Moses was considered to be meek in the book of Numbers, where we read through there. But yet, very strong, very courageous. Meekness, which is strength under control. Put these things on, is what he's saying. Long suffering. How long suffering are you? Or are you quick to not endure very long? That is enduring. Some versions say enduring. Bearing with others, not being overbearing, but bearing with. See the contrast between what we're to put on and what we're supposed to take off. Forgiving, that attitude of love towards those who have wronged us. What kind of an attitude do we have toward those that have wronged us? God says, put these kind of things on. Have this attitude of forgiveness. And of course, love. This idea of a sincere interest in the other's welfare. There's different kinds of love. We understand it. The kind of love he's talking about here is a sincere interest. You ever seen someone who loved you insincere? Oh, yeah. We've been there, haven't we? We know when people are sincere and when they're not sincere. And this is the kind of sincere love that we need to put on as Christians. In conclusion, we must live godly in this world. A couple verses as we conclude this morning. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of the world. The world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. If you're able to live godly in this ungodly world, God says you'll live forever. You will abide forever in eternity in heaven. How you doing? Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. For our citizenship is where? Ashland, Ohio? Well, yes, but where should it be? Our focus should be, our citizenship should be, is in heaven. From which we also eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. What profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world? Well, that would be great, right? That's what the world says. What profit is a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul? Or, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? What are folks giving in exchange for their soul? Not very much. Not very much. They're giving away their soul. Remember the story where Jacob and Esau, where he gave his birthright away for a bowl of soup? Are we doing the same? We are, aren't we? We sure are. We are giving our souls away for nothing. Because what are we really gaining? What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? John chapter 17, verse 16. That they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Live in the world, we say, live in the world, but just not of the world. Folks, if you're here this morning, and hopefully this lesson has struck a nerve with you. I hope it has. In that we realize that we need to live godly in this ungodly age. If you're here this morning and not a member of the Lord's church, what are you giving up for your soul? What are you exchanging for your soul? The question you have to ask yourself, and you have to sometimes do a soul search of yourself to find that answer. If you're here this morning and you've been raised with Christ, you're a member of the church, but maybe haven't been living godly as we know we should. Take this opportunity this morning. Don't leave this place before making things right with God. We're going to sing a song number 301 here in a moment. If you're needing to respond to the gospel's call this morning, we hope you will.